28th December, 1944. 0900 hours. A farmhouse 3 kilometers north of Barga, Tuscany. Captain James Morrison, intelligence officer of the United States 92nd Infantry Division, spread captured German documents across a wooden table, his hands trembling slightly as he read the same paragraph for the third time. The supply manifest listed rations for 9,100 men. Not 90,000. Not 19,000. 9,000. This can't be right, Morrison whispered, pulling another document from the stack. An operational order confirmed it. 2 Italian divisions and 3 German battalions. Total strength approximately 9,000 soldiers. 0 tanks. Morrison's division had fielded 18,000 men. They had 140 artillery pieces to the enemy's 100. They possessed 120 tanks. The Germans had none. And yet, over 72 hours, the Axis forces had advanced 25 kilometers, captured 250 American prisoners, seized enough equipment to fill 12 trucks, and sent 2 battalions of the 92nd into panicked retreat. What Morrison didn't know, as he sat in that cold Italian farmhouse calculating ratios that made no sense, was that he was witnessing the collision between material superiority and combat effectiveness, between what should happen according to the arithmetic of war and what actually happened when that arithmetic encountered human variables the numbers could never capture. The mathematics were staggering. The Allies had possessed a 2-to-1 advantage in manpower, a 7-to-6 advantage in artillery, and infinite advantage in armor, since the enemy had none. By every calculation Morrison had learned at Fort Benning, by every principle in the field manuals, by every doctrine preached by the War Department, the Axis attack should have shattered against American defensive positions like waves against rocks. Instead, the Americans had retreated 25 kilometers in under 3 days. The captured documents revealed the Axis had achieved an advance-to-strength ratio of 2.7 kilometers per 1,000 men. Meanwhile, the American defense-to-strength ratio had collapsed to minus 1.4 kilometers per 1,000 men. The attackers, outnumbered and outgunned, had penetrated faster per soldier than the defenders could hold ground per soldier. Morrison calculated the artillery disparity more carefully. 140 Allied guns versus 100 Axis pieces meant the Americans had possessed a 40% firepower advantage. Yet the Axis had captured American positions that should have been mathematically impossible to take. The tank advantage was even starker, infinite in the literal sense, 120 American armored vehicles against 0 German tanks. Somehow, this infinite superiority had proven irrelevant to the outcome. The Battle of Garfagnana had emerged from the strategic geometry of the Italian campaign in late 1944, after the fall of Rome in June and the steady Allied advance northward through the summer and autumn. The Gothic Line, Germany's defensive barrier across the Apennines, had stabilized the front. The western terminus of this line rested in the Serchio Valley of Tuscany, a sector defended by the American 92nd Infantry Division, a unit composed entirely of black soldiers, led primarily by white officers. Captain Morrison had arrived at the division in October, a Princeton graduate with a degree in history, who had scored high enough on intelligence aptitude tests to be assigned to G2. He had spent the past 2 months analyzing German defensive positions, calculating force ratios, and projecting Allied offensive capabilities for the spring. He believed, as did most Allied officers, that the Germans in Italy were finished. Their supply lines were strained, their manpower depleted, their strategic situation hopeless. The only question was how quickly they would collapse. The Serchio Valley sector had seemed quiet, almost peaceful compared to the brutal fighting in the mountains to the east. The division's mission was defensive, holding the line while more capable units, more experienced divisions, prepared for the final offensive. Morrison had spent December writing reports about German defensive weakness, about their inability to mount significant counterattacks, about how the spring offensive would roll over them. The first reports of the German attack had arrived at division headquarters shortly after dawn on December 26th. Initial assessments suggested a probe, perhaps a company-strength raid to capture prisoners for intelligence purposes. By mid-morning, the scope became clearer. This was a coordinated offensive across 3 axes, battalion-level attacks at minimum. By afternoon, the assessment escalated again. This was division level. Multiple divisions. Morrison had watched the situation map with growing alarm. Red markers indicating enemy positions moved southward with disturbing speed. Blue markers representing American units fell back, regrouped, fell back again. By evening of the 26th, the village of Somokolonia had fallen. By the morning of the 27th, Fornaci was lost. By afternoon, Pian di Corelia, a major objective, was in Axis hands. The division commander had called in reinforcements, and British Indian Army units from the 8th Infantry Division began arriving, veterans who had fought across North Africa and up through Italy. Their presence finally stabilized the line on the 28th. The Axis advance stopped. German and Italian forces consolidated their gains and prepared new defensive positions approximately 2 kilometers south of their original line. We need to understand what happened, the division commander had told Morrison on the evening of the 28th. Get me an after-action analysis. Talk to the unit commanders. Examine captured documents. I need to know why we failed. Morrison had spent the next 3 days interviewing survivors, examining defensive positions, and collecting captured German materials. Each conversation, each inspection, each document pulled him deeper into a reality he had not believed possible. The first revelation came at Somokolonia. Morrison arrived on the 30th of December, 2 days after the fighting ended. The village sat on a hilltop overlooking the Serchio Valley, a natural strong point. 2nd Battalion of the 366th Infantry Regiment had defended it with approximately 300 men, supported by artillery that could range any approach route. Lieutenant Colonel James Williams, the battalion commander, walked Morrison through the defensive positions. We had good fields of fire, Williams explained, pointing down the slopes. Anyone coming up those roads would be exposed for 400 meters. We had machine guns positioned to create interlocking fire. We had mortar crews pre-registered on likely assembly areas. By the book, we could have held against a force 3 times our size. What happened? Morrison asked. Williams was silent for a long moment, staring at the valley below. He was 38 years old, a career officer from Philadelphia who had commanded black troops since 1942. They hit us just before dawn. We heard them coming, moving up through the darkness. We opened fire when they reached 200 meters. Our machine guns were working, our mortars dropping rounds right where they should be. And they kept coming. Morrison examined the German approach routes. He found scattered equipment, shell craters, blood on the snow. The physical evidence suggested the American fire had been effective. The Germans had taken casualties, but they had not stopped. They reached the first houses by 0630. Williams continued. We fell back to secondary positions. They pressed us. By 0800, we were fighting house to house in the village center. By 0900, I gave the order to withdraw. We'd lost 60 men killed or wounded, another 40 captured. The rest retreated toward Coreglia. Morrison did the mathematics. The Americans had held for approximately 3 hours. They had possessed superior positions, adequate ammunition, supporting fires. They had inflicted casualties, and they had broken. "How many attackers?" Morrison asked. "We estimated 2 battalions," Williams said. "Maybe 1,200 men." 4-to-1 odds. The Germans had attacked uphill against prepared defenses with 4-to-1 numerical disadvantage, and won. Morrison felt something cold settling in his stomach. At Bebbio, 7 kilometers south, Morrison found similar stories. The forward observation post had been overrun at dawn. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, one of 3 survivors, described the action. Thompson was 26, a former railroad worker from Georgia who had been in the Army since 1942. "They came out of the mist," Thompson said. "We saw them at maybe 50 yards. We opened up with everything. The Browning was hammering. We were throwing grenades. But they just kept coming. 3 of them went down, then 4, then 2 more. Didn't matter. They reached our position inside 2 minutes. It was hand to hand. Jackson got bayoneted. Davis took one in the chest. I made it out because I ran. Just ran." Morrison examined the position. It had been well sighted, with good cover and clear fields of fire. He found spent American cartridge cases by the hundreds. He found 6 German graves, hastily dug. The position had exacted casualties. It had simply failed to stop the attack. "The ones who made it through?" Morrison asked. "How did they seem?" Thompson thought carefully. Determined. Like they knew exactly what they were doing. Professional. We were shooting at them, and they weren't panicking, weren't running away. They were moving cover to cover, suppressing us, advancing, like a textbook assault. Better than our own training. At Fornaci, Morrison found evidence of a different kind of failure. The village had been defended by a company of the 366th Regiment, approximately 120 men. It had fallen with almost no resistance. The Germans had captured it by mid-morning of the 26th, with minimal casualties on either side. Captain Robert Hayes commanded the company. He was 29, from Detroit, a schoolteacher in civilian life commissioned after officer candidate school. "We heard firing to the north," Hayes told Morrison. "Heavy fighting at Samokolonia. Then we saw German infantry approaching from the northeast. I called battalion for instructions. They told us to hold." "Did you engage?" Hayes looked away. Some of the men fired. But when the Germans got within 200 meters, most of the company started falling back. I tried to stop them, tried to organize a defensive line, but they kept moving south. Within an hour, we'd abandoned the village. I couldn't hold them. Morrison pressed for details. "Were you outnumbered?" "Hard to say. Maybe 200 Germans. We had defensive positions, buildings for cover. We should have held." "Why didn't you?" Hayes met Morrison's eyes. "Captain, half my men have been in combat less than a month. They're replacements, mostly. The Germans hit Samokolonia hard. The men heard the firing, knew the 84th was getting overrun. They thought we'd be next. Fear spread faster than I could control it." Morrison found himself writing the same words again and again in his notes. Fell back. Withdrew without orders. Could not hold men in position. Panic. Rout. The pattern became undeniable as he interviewed more survivors. At Scarpello, a platoon had abandoned its position after 20 minutes of contact. At Correglia, 2 companies had retreated when they heard German armor, though no German tanks existed. At Asher Molazzano, Italian troops had attacked and been stopped by Indian units arriving from the south, but only after the Americans had already fallen back. The captured German documents told the other side of the story. Morrison spent 2 full days translating operational orders, supply manifests, and after-action reports. The Axis force had consisted of the 4th Alpine Division Monte Rosa, the 3rd Marine Division San Marco, and 3 German mountain infantry battalions. Total strength, 9,100 men. They had 100 artillery pieces, most of them lighter than American guns. They had 0 tanks. Their supply situation was desperate, their ammunition limited, their food stock sufficient for only 4 days of operations. The German operational plan had been explicit about limitations. The attack could advance only as far as supplies permitted. The maximum objective was a 2-kilometer penetration. If American resistance proved strong, the operation would be called off within 24 hours. The entire offensive was a calculated gamble, a raid to capture supplies and improve defensive positions before the expected Allied spring offensive. Yet they had advanced 25 kilometers. They had captured enough American supplies to sustain themselves for another week. They had taken 250 prisoners. They had inflicted approximately 400 casualties while suffering only 150 themselves, a 2.7 to 1 exchange ratio in their favor, despite being the attackers. Morrison calculated and recalculated. The Germans had achieved their objectives with a force less than half the size of the defenders. They had done so with inferior artillery support and no armor. They had penetrated 12.5 times deeper than their original maximum objective. Every metric suggested this should have been impossible. If these numbers are accurate, Morrison said to Major William Bradford, the division's operations officer, then we need to fundamentally rethink our assessments of combat power. Bradford, 42, a regular Army officer from Virginia, looked at Morrison's calculations. The numbers are accurate. I've verified them through multiple sources. German prisoners confirm their unit strengths. The Indian Brigade commanders who stopped the attack assessed Axis forces at 8 to 10,000. Our own casualty counts matched German claims. Then how did this happen? Bradford was quiet for a moment. Captain, may I speak frankly? Please. The 92nd is not an effective combat division. It hasn't been since we arrived in Italy. We have good men, capable soldiers, but they're poorly led, inadequately trained, and they know the Army doesn't believe in them. When you put black troops under white officers who don't respect them, when you give them inadequate preparation and then send them into combat, when you create a unit that's fundamentally built on inequality, you get a force that doesn't fight well. The Germans know this. They chose this sector specifically because they knew we'd break. Morrison felt his professional assumptions crumbling. But the mathematics, the force ratios, the equipment advantages don't matter if men won't fight. The Germans had half our numbers, but twice our will. They had worse equipment, but better training. They were outnumbered, but they knew what they were doing and believed they could win. We had every advantage except the only one that mattered, which is soldiers who trust their leaders and believe in their mission. The second revelation came from examining Indian unit performance. The 19th Infantry Brigade and 21st Infantry Brigade of the 8th Indian Infantry Division had arrived on the 27th and 28th of December. These were veteran units, blooded in North Africa and Italy, composed of Punjabi, Sikh, Gurkha, and other troops from the British Indian Army. Brigadier Ronald Cameron, commanding the 19th Brigade, agreed to brief Morrison on his unit's actions. Cameron was 51, a career British officer who had served in India since 1925. We arrived on the 27th with 2 battalions forward, Cameron explained. The situation was fluid. American units were falling back in some disorder. German and Italian forces were advancing along multiple axes. I positioned my troops across the most likely approach routes and waited. What happened when the Germans hit your positions? They didn't press hard. They probed our lines, took some casualties, and pulled back. I think they realized they were facing different opposition. We'd established proper defensive positions, maintained unit cohesion, and responded effectively to their fire. After several hours of contact, they stopped trying to advance through our sector. Morrison examined the casualty figures. The Indian units had suffered 12 killed and 38 wounded while stopping German advances that had previously rolled over American positions. The exchange ratio was approximately 3-to-1 in favor of the defenders. Why the difference in performance? Morrison asked, knowing the question was dangerous. Cameron chose his words carefully. Captain, I don't wish to disparage your division, but my troops are professional soldiers. Most have been in service for years. They're well-trained, well-led, and they fought together as units through multiple campaigns. They trust their officers because those officers have proven themselves in combat. When they're ordered to hold a position, they hold it because they know we wouldn't give that order unless it was possible to execute. That's not about race or nationality. It's about training, experience, and unit cohesion. The contrast was devastating. Same terrain, same enemy, same equipment, different results. Morrison realized he was documenting not just a tactical failure, but a systemic one. The third revelation came from interviewing German prisoners. Morrison spoke with Hauptmann Klaus Richter, a company commander from the Axis forces captured during the withdrawal. Richter was 34, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had been transferred to Italy in September 1944. We were told to expect minimal resistance, Richter explained in fluent English. Intelligence assessments indicated the American 92nd Division was not combat effective. Our orders specified that if we encountered serious opposition, we were to withdraw immediately. The operation was designed as a raid, not a breakthrough. What did you encounter? Exactly what we expected. Some positions fought well initially, but most collapsed quickly. We took casualties from artillery and small arms fire, but American infantry wouldn't hold their positions. Once we pressed them, they retreated. By the second day, we had achieved objectives we thought would take a week. Morrison felt sick. The Americans had twice your numbers. Richter shrugged. Numbers mean nothing if soldiers won't stand and fight. We were outnumbered in Russia all the time. You learn that training and morale matter more than manpower. Your division had the numbers, but not the fighting spirit. If we had faced British or veteran American divisions, we would have been stopped in the first day. Against the 92nd, we advanced until our supplies ran out and the Indian troops arrived. The evidence continued accumulating. Morrison interviewed 23 American officers and 68 enlisted men. He examined 14 defensive positions. He translated 42 captured German documents. Each source confirmed the same essential truth. The 92nd Infantry Division, despite possessing overwhelming material advantages, had failed to provide effective resistance against a smaller, poorly equipped enemy force. Private First Class James Wilson, 22 from Mississippi, had fought at Samokolonia. Sir, I'll tell you straight. We didn't believe we could win. The officers didn't believe in us. The other divisions looked down on us. When the Germans came, some men fought hard, real hard. But most of us were thinking about survival, not victory. You can't win if you're just trying not to die. Sergeant Harold Washington, 30, from Chicago, had commanded a squad at Fornaci. The white officers don't trust us. We can feel it. They give orders but don't explain why. They position us but don't coordinate properly. When things got hot, we weren't fighting as a unit. We were just individuals trying to stay alive. The Germans were fighting as a team. That's the difference. Lieutenant Richard Anderson, 27, from Boston, one of the few black officers in the division, spoke carefully. "Captain, you want to know why we failed? Look at how this division was created. Black soldiers under white leadership in an army that's segregated. Men who could be officers are serving as enlisted because of their skin color. Soldiers who could be squad leaders are passed over for less qualified white men. We're told we're equal, then treated as inferior. When you build a unit on that foundation, don't be surprised when it doesn't fight well." Morrison compiled his findings into a report. The mathematics were inescapable. The 92nd Infantry Division had been defeated by a force approximately half its size, with inferior equipment and no armored support. The attackers had achieved an advance rate of 8.3 kilometers per day. The defenders had conducted a fighting withdrawal at a rate of negative 8.3 kilometers per day. The force exchange ratio had been 2.7 to 1 in favor of the attackers, despite all tactical doctrine indicating defenders should achieve at least 3 to 1 advantages. Artillery expenditure told its own story. American forces had fired approximately 4,500 rounds during the 3-day battle. German forces had fired approximately 2,000 rounds. Yet German fire had been more effective, forcing American withdrawals, while American fire had merely slowed German advances without stopping them. The ammunition expenditure ratio of 2.25 to 1 in American favor had produced zero advantage in combat outcomes. The human cost was equally stark. American casualties totaled approximately 400 killed, wounded, or missing. German and Italian casualties totaled approximately 150. The casualty exchange ratio of 2.7 to 1 favored the attackers, inverting every principle of defensive warfare. Historically, attackers accepted higher casualties than defenders. At Garfagnani, defenders suffered nearly triple the losses of attackers. Morrison documented specific examples that illustrated the larger pattern. At Hill 234, a platoon of 32 men had abandoned prepared positions after 15 minutes of contact with an estimated 40 German soldiers. The position was never assaulted. The Americans simply left. At Correglia, 2 companies totaling 180 men had retreated when German forces of approximately 100 soldiers approached, despite the Americans holding better terrain with prepared defenses and supporting fires. The captured equipment lists revealed another dimension of failure. German forces had captured 12 M1919A 4 light machine guns, 7 M2 heavy machine guns, 4 M1917A 6.5 centimeter recoilless rifles, approximately 15,000 rounds of .303 caliber ammunition, 3,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, 2,000 K rations, 68 rifles, and assorted other equipment. This represented approximately 15% of the defending force's basic load, abandoned in retreat. Morrison interviewed Captain Thomas Drake, 32, from New York, who had commanded a company at Calavorno. We had good positions. We had ammunition. We had supporting fires. But when the Italians started advancing, half my men bugged out. Just left. I was screaming orders, threatening them. But they kept going. 20 minutes into the fight, I had 40 men left out of 110. We couldn't hold with that. I ordered withdrawal to save what remained. Why did they leave? Drake's voice was bitter. Because they'd been told all their lives they weren't good enough. The Army reinforced that every day. Segregated units, white officers, constant reminders they were second-class soldiers. When combat came, they believed what they'd been told. They believed they couldn't win. so they didn't try. The psychological dimension became clear through accumulated testimony. Soldiers described feeling isolated, unsupported, expendable. They spoke of white officers who didn't learn their names, who refused to eat with them, who openly expressed doubt about black combat capabilities. They mentioned training that emphasized manual labor over combat skills, preparation that focused on support roles rather than fighting. "We dug more ditches than we fired rifles," said Private First Class Robert Hayes, 24, from Alabama. "We loaded more trucks than we practiced squad tactics. When we finally got to Italy, we were defending the quiet sector because nobody expected us to fight well. Turns out they were right." Staff Sergeant Ernest Miller, 29, from Texas, had fought across 3 defensive positions. "Sir, I've been in this man's army 3 years. I've watched white units get priority for equipment, for training, for everything. We get told we're soldiers, and then treated like laborers. When the shooting started, nobody was surprised we didn't fight well. That's what everyone expected." Morrison found himself documenting a failure that transcended tactics or strategy. This was institutional failure, the predictable result of building a military organization on principles of inequality and then expecting it to function effectively in combat. The contrast with the Indian units was instructive. Brigadier Cameron's forces, while part of a colonial army with its own problematic dynamics, functioned as professional military organizations. Officers and men had trained together, fought together, developed trust and cohesion. When German forces probed their lines, the Indians held because they operated as disciplined units with clear command structures and mutual confidence. The final revelation came from examining why the German offensive stopped. Morrison interviewed Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Schmidt, the German battalion commander captured during the withdrawal, in a prisoner of war facility near Florence. Schmidt was 41, another Eastern Front veteran, decorated for actions in Russia. "We stopped because we achieved our objectives," Schmidt explained. "We captured supplies, improved our defensive line, took prisoners for intelligence. But primarily we stopped because the Indian troops arrived. Those were real soldiers, professional. When we encountered them, we knew the easy advance was over. Fighting them would cost casualties we couldn't afford. So we consolidated our gains and pulled back to defensible positions. If the Indians hadn't arrived..." Schmidt smiled without humor. "We could have reached Lucca, maybe Pisa. Your 92nd would not have stopped us. We had neither the supplies nor the strategic objective to attempt that. But tactically, we faced no effective resistance from American forces. The Indians saved your entire position in that sector." Morrison included Schmidt's assessment in his report, noting that enemy commanders had predicted American performance with uncomfortable accuracy. The German operational plan had specifically targeted the 92nd Division sector, expecting minimal resistance based on intelligence assessments of unit morale and effectiveness. Those assessments had proven correct. The weight of evidence became crushing. Morrison spent sleepless nights reviewing his data, checking calculations, verifying sources. Every analysis confirmed the same conclusion. The Battle of Garfagnana represented a complete inversion of normal force ratio calculations. The side with twice the manpower, superior equipment, better supply, and defensive advantage had been routed by an inferior force that succeeded through superior training, unit cohesion, and leadership. He thought about his education at Princeton, about military history courses that emphasized materiel and manpower. He thought about doctrine that calculated combat power through equipment counts and force ratios. He thought about every report he had written predicting Allied success based on numerical superiority. None of it had mattered here. Morrison recorded his mental state in a letter to his wife. I came to Italy believing warfare was a science, that we could calculate outcomes through force ratios and logistics. Garfagnana taught me that numbers mean nothing without the human factors that make soldiers fight. We had every advantage, except the ones that mattered. The Army created a division designed to fail, then express surprise when it failed. I don't know if I can continue serving in an organization that functions this way. The division commander read Morrison's report in silence. When he finished, he looked at the intelligence officer with tired eyes. Captain, this report is accurate, well documented, and completely unacceptable. If I forward this up the chain, it will destroy the 92nd Division's reputation permanently. It will provide ammunition to everyone who opposed black combat troops. It will set back integration efforts by decades. Sir, the facts are the facts. The facts are complicated. Yes, we performed poorly. Yes, the Germans exploited our weaknesses. Yes, the institutional racism of the Army contributed to our failure. But if we document this, honestly, the lesson won't be that the Army needs to treat black soldiers better. The lesson will be that black soldiers can't fight. That's what they'll take from this. Morrison understood the trap. The truth would be weaponized against the very soldiers who had been set up to fail. What do you want me to do, sir? Write a sanitized version. Blame German surprise, unfavorable terrain, tactical errors. Don't mention the force ratios. Don't mention that veteran units stopped them easily. Don't mention that we had every advantage and lost anyway. Give them something they can accept without destroying us. Morrison spent 3 days producing 2 reports. The official version emphasized German tactical surprise, difficult terrain, and aggressive enemy action. It noted that reinforcing Indian units stabilized the situation. It recommended improved defensive preparations and better coordination. It said nothing about force ratios, combat effectiveness, or institutional racism. The second report, marked personal and confidential, went into Morrison's footlocker. It contained every fact, every calculation, every interview that told the true story. He didn't know what he would do with it, but he couldn't destroy the truth entirely. The Battle of Garfagnana disappeared into the broader narrative of the Italian campaign. Official histories mentioned it briefly, describing a German spoiling attack that achieved temporary success before being contained by Allied reinforcements. The force ratios were never published. The performance disparities between American and Indian units were not analyzed. The lessons about institutional racism and combat effectiveness were not learned. The 92nd Infantry Division continued serving in Italy through the end of the war. Its performance remained problematic. After the war, opponents of military integration cited the division's record as proof that black soldiers couldn't fight effectively. Supporters countered that the unit had been set up for failure through inadequate training and discriminatory leadership. Morrison served out the war, was promoted to major, and returned to civilian life in 1946. He took his confidential report with him. He never published it. In 1968, as the military was fully integrating, he donated his papers to the Army War College, where historians eventually discovered the true account of Garfagnana. The battle's lessons remained relevant. In Vietnam, the Army again struggled with racial tensions and unit cohesion issues. In the all-volunteer force era, the military slowly learned that effectiveness required more than equipment and manpower. It required trust, training, leadership, and treating soldiers with dignity regardless of race. Captain James Morrison died in 1979 at age 61. Among his papers, historians found a handwritten note dated December 31st, 1944. It read, "Today I learned that armies are not mathematics. You cannot calculate courage. You cannot quantify cohesion. You cannot measure morale in spreadsheets. The Germans had 9,000 men. We had 18,000. They won because they believed they could, and we believed we couldn't. Everything else was footnote. The battlefield at Garfagnana is quiet now, marked by small memorials to Italian partisans and American soldiers. Tour guides mention the battle briefly when they mention it at all. Few visitors understand what really happened there in those 3 days between Christmas and New Year, 1944 and 1945. But in the archives of military education, Morrison's confidential report remains required reading for officers studying unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. The opening page contains his simple summary. We possessed 2-to-1 numerical superiority, significant firepower advantage, infinite armor superiority, and defensive positions. We lost to an inferior force because superior numbers mean nothing without the will to fight. Competent leadership, unit trust, and soldiers who believe in their mission. The Army created the 92nd Division in violation of these principles, and then blamed the soldiers when the predictable failure occurred. The final irony of Garfagnana lies in what it revealed but didn't change. Morrison's discovery that material superiority means nothing without human factors that make soldiers fight was documented but largely ignored. The Army continued segregating units for another 4 years. The institution continued assuming that force ratios and equipment counts determined outcomes. The mathematics of war continued overshadowing the humanity of war. Morrison had calculated the ratios correctly that morning in the farmhouse north of Barga. 9,000 versus 18,000. 100 artillery pieces versus 140. 0 tanks versus 120. The numbers were accurate. His error was believing the numbers mattered. What mattered was that 9,000 German and Italian soldiers believed they could succeed, were led by officers who believed in them, functioned as cohesive units with clear command and purpose. What mattered was that 18,000 American soldiers had been told all their lives they were inferior, were led by officers who didn't respect them, functioned as a collection of individuals rather than a unified force. The Germans advanced 25 kilometers, not despite being outnumbered and outgunned, but because they were professional soldiers who knew their craft. The Americans retreated not despite having superior numbers and equipment, but because they were a force built on inequality and undermined by institutional racism that guaranteed poor performance. History judges Garfagnana as a minor action, a footnote to the Italian campaign, 3 days of fighting that changed nothing strategic. But for Captain James Morrison, and for every soldier who fought there, and for military organizations still learning that people matter more than mathematics, the battle represents something more fundamental. It stands as proof that warfare remains human, despite all attempts to reduce it to calculations. That trust and training and leadership and dignity matter more than any material advantage, and that armies built on principles of inequality will fail regardless of their resources. The mathematics were clear. The mathematics were irrelevant. That was the lesson Morrison learned in that cold Italian farmhouse on December 28, 1944, as he studied captured documents that revealed a truth the Army wasn't ready to acknowledge. Superior numbers guarantee nothing. Material advantage means nothing. In the end, armies are people, and people fight best when they're trained well, led well, and treated with the dignity every soldier deserves. Everything else is arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't win battles. People do.